Thanks, Jane. I'm Ben Godfrey, and you're watching Midlands Today. Good evening. Tributes from across the Midlands are being paid to Ozzy Osbourne, founding father of heavy metal music, a Birmingham legend who has died at the age of 76. The Prince of Darkness and Black Sabbath frontman had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2019. Well, the band had performed an historic farewell gig in the city just over a fortnight ago. Our reporter Kevin Reid has been in Birmingham tonight, meeting fans.
The unmistakable Ozzy Osbourne, but sadly no longer with us. The heavy metal legend passing away this morning, surrounded by his family. The news wasn't made public until this evening, but within an hour, fans and admirers were gathering in Birmingham. Ian Marshall had travelled up from Cardiff this morning to celebrate his own birthday by doing a Sabbath tour.
There's a mural of Ozzy Osbourne in Digbeth, and we were actually having a photo taken outside that mural as our phone started pinging to say Ozzy was dead, and I'm absolutely devastated.
Meanwhile, here at the Black Sabbath Bridge on Broad Street, people have started to congregate to show their respects. Flowers have also been laid, and it's little over an hour since the news of Ozzy's passing was announced. Amongst them, Jim Simpson, who managed Ozzy and his band in their very early days.
The last time I saw him was not very far from this very spot, actually. He came to Birmingham to receive his star on Broad Street, and they gave him a green room up in the ICC over there. And I spent the afternoon there with him and his two aunties. He was a much nicer, quieter, sweeter human being than most people realise, and he'll be much missed. Lifelong fans Donna and Sue were in a pub in Wolverhampton when they heard the news.
That's our youth there. That's our youth.
Yeah, it is. When our neighbours used to moan about us having the music too loud.
Yeah.
Mum used to come and moan at us, hadn't she, because we got it too
loud.
loud.
And that is why.
You know, we grew up with Ozzy. He's part of our childhood.
I think for Birmingham, I think metal will go on. I think, Sabbath, had their last album a few years back, but they are an influence. And I think they will continue to be an influence and an inspiration for bands in the heavier side of music in Birmingham and the West Midlands.
Ozzy's poor health was well known, but he continued to create unforgettable moments right until the very end.
Remembering Ozzy Osbourne. Kevin joins us now. Powerful tributes, remarkable reaction on social media tonight.
Yes, it's been flooded with tributes to Ozzy, and sometimes just a few words says it all. This was Black Sabbath, who were speaking on X earlier. They simply said, Ozzy forever. Rolling Stone, Ronnie Wood, who made a surprise appearance at the final gig, said, I'm so very sad to hear the death of Ozzy Osbourne. What a lovely goodbye concert he had at the back to the beginning in Birmingham. UB40 with Ali Campbell, another Birmingham music institution. They said, the Prince of Darkness, a true Birmingham legend, the undisputed king of heavy metal. You didn't just shape a culture, you defined it. You led from the front and never looked back. My thoughts are with Sharon and the entire Osbourne family during this time. And also Aston Villa, where Back to the Beginning was staged recently. But they say Aston Villa Football Club is saddened to learn that world-renowned rock star and villain Ozzy Osbourne has passed away. Growing up in Aston, not far from Villa Park, Ozzy always held a special connection to the club and the community he came from. The thoughts of everyone at Aston Villa are with his wife Sharon, his family, friends and countless fans at this extremely difficult time. Rest in peace, Ozzy. And tributes to Ozzy also reflecting his long battle with Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's UK's chief executive said, by speaking so openly about both his diagnosis and life with Parkinson's, Ozzy and all his family helped so many other families in the same situation.
A man who's sealed his place in popular culture. Kevin, thank you. Well, we'd like to hear your tributes to Ozzy. Here's how you can get in touch. Scan the QR code on screen now, or you can email midlandstoday@bbc.co.uk. And there's also a live page with updates on the BBC News website. Some more of the day's news now, and 3 men have been arrested on suspicion of murder following the death of a man who was struck by a car in Birmingham. It happened yesterday evening on Ormscliffe Road in Rednall. The injured man, who was in his 20s, sustained serious injuries and died in hospital last night. The men arrested, who are all 28, remain in custody for questioning. Police are appealing for any dashcam or CCTV footage. A 19-year-old councillor has been formally appointed as leader of Warwickshire County Council. Reform UK's George Finch is now the youngest permanent council leader in the country after being elected in May. He now faces the task of running a local authority with assets and a budget worth £2 billion.
The people of Warwickshire spoke on May 1st, electing 22 reform councillors. We are committed with honesty, integrity and respect to the residents to ensure that the people of Warwickshire have the best future and to ensure that the people have the best way forward.
Let's check in the weather forecast now with Shafali.
Hello, a very good evening to you. Well, it was cloudier overall today and a mixed bag. We did have some brightness, some showers as well. You can see quite a bit of cloud over the Staffordshire Moorlands towards Leek. But as the week wears on, it is going to become a little drier. We have high pressure building from the west. So by Thursday, you'll start to notice the difference, but we're also sucking up warmer air. As for tonight, well, we've got a feed of showers from the southwest. Those could be quite heavy across southern counties, but they should fade away later in the night and there'll be some clearer spells. But again, largely cloudy, lows of 12 to 14 Celsius. And then tomorrow, although it should be drier due to that high pressure building from the west, there could still be a few showers cropping up and some of them could be on the heavy side, but highs of 22 with light north to northwesterly winds.
That's all for now. There'll be more tributes and memories of Ozzy Osbourne's life during BBC Breakfast tomorrow. Good night.